Evet sevgili konuklarımız, günün son etkinliği az önce söylediğim gibi, kavramımızda önce söylediğim gibi üretken yapay zeka konusunda konuşacağız. Biraz SWOT analizi gibi olacak aslında. Çok değerli iki konuğumuz var. Sedef Akınlı Koçak ve Cameron Schuler bizimle beraber. Doğal olarak İngilizce olacak toplantımız. Welcome Sedef and Cameron, and stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Cameron. Hi.
Hello,
Thank you
Sedef.
so much. Hi. Hello, everyone. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank, first of all, Turkish AI Week organizers for the invitation and putting together an amazing in-person and virtual series of talks and events. So unfortunately, we won't be able to there with you in person, but hopefully next year we will be joining you in person in Istanbul. So and we'll talk about more. So in this session, it's my honor to introduce Cameron Schuler. He is the Chief Commercialization Officer and Vice President, Industry Innovation at the Vector Institute. He is the former Executive Director of AMI, Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, where for 8 years, he led one of the top-ranked machine learning and AI groups in the world. Cameron's multi-phased career has covered finance, business, and product development, and consumer product, IT, and general management from startups to mature companies. His industry experience includes alternative energy, banking, consumer product, information technology, investment sales and trading, life sciences, manufacturing, and many more. He has founded numerous startup companies, and Cameron is a chair and co-founder of PFM Scheduling Services, and he was managing director and co-founder of Schuler Law Group and spent 8 years in investment and sales and trading. He attained his MBA from Queen's University and completed numerous investment management programs. And it's my pleasure to chat with you today, Cameron, about opportunities and impact of generative AI. So insights from Vector Institute Generative AI Roundtables. And we're going to have some recommendations to business leaders on how they can help their organizations to be prepared for this transformative power of generative AI. To start off, I would like to give our audience a quick introduction about Vector Institute for those who are not familiar with. The Vector Institute is a non-for-profit research institute in Canada that focuses on advancement of machine learning research, especially deep learning. It's based in Toronto, province of Ontario, and was founded in 2017 under Pan-Canadian AI strategy. Vector's primary mission is to advance machine learning research and AI innovation by conducting cutting-edge research in various machine learning fields, such as natural language processing, computer vision, and reinforcement learning. In addition to that, Vector provides many programs, including collaborative projects, education and training sessions and programs to increase AI capability of industries and upskill their employees. And Vector collaborates many enterprise companies and organizations to address their real-world AI challenges and applications, and making it hub for AI research and development in Canada. So since Cameron and I talk about generative AI today, so first I would like to start with a quick definition of what generative AI means. So generative AI refers to a category of machine learning algorithms that generate new outputs based on the data that have been trained on. So you might ask, okay, so well, what kind of output is this? So that's a fair question. They can create a whole range of things like images, music, and text, and even videos. Recently, we have seen a lot. And then generative AI, especially large language models, are like a knowledgeable librarians that have read all the books in the library and can create a unique content based on what they have learned. So we all know that generative AI started to gain a huge attention on OpenAI when they released ChatGPT in November 2022, which is around like approximately a year ago. while its full potential is still to be determined, it's clear that the technology is becoming a disruptor across all the industries, while the potential of transform nearly every part of the businesses. So we're going to talk about today. So my first question to you, Cameron, is that in your opinion, what are the opportunities you foresee arising from the mainstream generative AI tools?
Thank you, Sadaf, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I think we'd look at this in a couple of categories. So one category would be experts. And what do I mean by this? So generative AI is nothing new. So if you have a phone and you're typing on it, it will give you the next word that it thinks you're trying to type, and you can just hit that instead of finishing to type the word. And Sadaf and I certainly know people that have, Graham got his PhD, one of our researchers got his PhD in generative, what would be now called generative AI. He finished in 2009 or graduated in 2009, so quite a while ago. And so if we think about, the reason I say experts is right now, if you think about people that code, the ability to have Copilot to actually help you on your coding, and whether you use it for troubleshooting or you use it for adding additional pieces of code or even accelerating your learning curve. So I think those make sense. I think on the other side, certainly ChatGPT is the most familiar to people, I would expect. If you think about how that works, on some level, it's an extension of search, right? You put in questions, you get answers back, which is really what search is. But it also is trying to do it in a way that is human friendly. And so I think that's an interesting perspective, just in terms of its goal is to actually give you something that reads well. It might not be true, but it reads well. And so that's why I think experts are important. So another example I would use from one of our researchers is he said, when I put in questions about machine learning, it's really good because he's an expert in the space and can actually understand what the output from GPT-4 is. And he said, it's great. Says that he doesn't know anything about Western philosophy. So when he puts in things on Western philosophy, it looks really good, but he doesn't know if it's real or not or correct. And so I think that judgment piece is a key right now. But the field's moving pretty quickly. But I would think for people that aren't experts in the field, good things you can use it for are if you want to write a longer email, if you want to take something you've written. And I'm not a great writer. And so I use other tools like Grammarly and other things to help me with writing. But I can also take something I've written, put it into ChatGPT and say, make this read more friendly, make this read in a way that is more clear, and it will actually do that for me. So for me, that's a pretty good acceleration of work. And the other thing that it's good at, and unfortunately this is the paid version, but it's about $20 a month, is I can ask it for some summaries on particular topics. And there's something called hallucinations, which are, it makes things up, and it can even do that for references, by the way. But when I actually ask it to explain terms to me or ask it to summarize a document, I'll actually ask for references to the specific places in the document so I can go back and check. So I think those are areas where, rather than reading an article that'll take me half an hour, maybe I get a summary that's 2 or 3 minutes, and I can do enough fact checking on it that in another couple minutes I know it was a good article. So those are some of the easy ways people can interact with it.
Thank you so much. So what I'm hearing is that people can interact with and then use those technologies as an aid, right? So and then we have similar other technologies that we use when we are working or doing our job, or like a personal or our private life. So you mentioned about like a Google search when it first comes. So, we use them a lot now. Now we're still using Google search or like other search engines, not specifically Google, but search engines. So it is, it gives us some, freedom to look at like a different resources. And then when the results come, so then we are the ones who are selecting which ones, top 5 is the most relevant content that we are interested in, right? So, and then you talk about hallucinations. So we're going to deep dive into hallucinations in a minute or two. So I think this is an important, and then the judgment piece that you mentioned that we're going to talk about a bit later. So
I actually want to touch on one of those comments you made. So you were talking about how we do Google searches or searches. So we're looking for information. So we'll go and we'll do searches as people do and to find information, and then we'll take it and interpret it into what we want. And what we're really asking this next generation of models to do is take a bunch of different searches and turn it into one thing to provide us information. And so I think, that's a huge change, but I think that when you look at the difference between us reading something and using judgment or a system doing it, I think that's a really relevant point.
Yeah, thank you. So as companies integrate generative AI into their businesses, such as marketing, IT, risk management, and many more, so organizational requirements shift. So now I'd like to briefly talk about our generative AI roundtables at Vector. So we collaborated with many industry companies and bring them together to discuss application of cutting-edge AI technologies, what we called roundtable discussions. So series of 3 roundtables were held related to generative AI starting on March 2023. And we brought Vector researchers and AI leaders and practitioners from different companies. And we talked about the opportunities and risk related to generative AI and their impact on future of work. So the participants discussed about generative AI and how they already been successfully deployed to power content marketing, for example, or transcription services and other applications before the recent explosion of the interest. So there was also a strong interest among the participants in the idea of personalizing models for individual business use. So for example, a private or secure model trained on your own data would be far more useful for writing an emails than a universal chatbot. So such a model could automate mundane tasks for us, such as filling out forms. So my question to you, Cameron, is that what do you foresee some of the opportunities, these technologies in businesses particular, and how can businesses manage these opportunities to ensure a just transition to the future of work?
That's a good question. AI really, I think, has created uncertainty with people and some degree of fear. And some of that is, will I be replaced by a computer instead of having my current job? And so I think companies need to reward people for using technology. And I think, we can, if we see the evolution of law as a good example, where previously, if you're doing an acquisition of a company, you might have to have hundreds of thousands of pages of contracts being read. And so you would have your articling students. In Canada, that's the way it works. When you come out of school, you have a year of articles before you become a lawyer. And then you'd have your early stage lawyers, and they just sit down and read and read and read. And so the next transition to that was search, where you could actually look for terms that could be negative for the company. And now I think the next step of this really is the creation of documents and the ability to reduce that human interaction piece even more. And what that means is it'll make people more efficient. And so the volume of work can go up. So I think that's one example. So I think there are concerns around, and we've seen this with all technologies, concerns of people saying, what's going to happen to me? So companies being open of, how can this make your job better rather than replace you, is the right direction to go. So that's one part of it. Next part comes back to size of company. And so there isn't a lot of visibility into how these models work. So when you put data into them, is your data going to train the model? And is your data going to potentially be brought out again? So for example, Vector has a bunch of things online. We have all our work policies online. And so if you went and you said, what is Vector's policy on intellectual property? You can find that. But if you wanted to say, what is Vector's policy on something that's internal? All of a sudden that shows up because maybe somebody put it into a online tool. So you need to be very aware of what happens to your data. So you shouldn't be afraid of it. You just need to be knowledgeable. I think things like creating PowerPoints. So Microsoft's can add Copilot to their Office suite that'll help you create things. I want to create a table that's this size, and this is the database I want to reference, or the Excel spreadsheet I want to reference. So I think those will be interesting. So it really is, how can you get wins using generative AI, and how can you do it in an area that's not risky? That's the other thing. So risky would be, historically, what you do in AI is you would train a model, and once you're comfortable with how that model works, you would you'd have a version control, you'd stop it, and you'd put it into production. Then you'd continue to train it outside of that, but you wouldn't have a model working and learning in real time, because anyone that tried to do that had horrible outcomes. So I think it was Microsoft put one on Twitter that became racist very quickly. So it's like, all right, this is a bad idea. Now we're seeing where these models are actually learning in real time and being used in real time. And so that's really different. So what I mean by low risk is you wouldn't take generative AI and have that be your customer service chat. But what you might have is you'd have people who are experts, starting with a generative AI, and I'm talking about a call center or a service center of some form where you're interacting with customers. And you'd have them asking questions of that to make sure the questions coming out are good. And then you'd have your less experienced people, when they're interacting with customers, be able to find the information. So I think opportunities like that are good. So still the human in the loop on this, but just thinking about how you can become more efficient through the application of generative AI really is the right way to go initially.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think what I'm hearing is that I think the knowledge is important. So how you train your employees, like how they're going to use these kind of technologies. So employee varies from, high technical advanced, background to, like a different business line, like HR or like a different business line. I think this is important to how you educate your employees about using or implications or opportunities about this kind of technologies. Also the risk of those technologies, how they use it, when they use it, and what are the important steps. So maybe creating a guidelines or code of conduct for the employees. And then I think those are the important points. So I recently came across machine learning explanation. This was really not important, of course, we know what machine learning is, but how do you define machine learning in 3 words? So this was by Casey Korsikov. So she is a Google former chief decision scientist. So she was asked how to define machine learning in 3 words. So she responded, the supervised learning is get answer right. And unsupervised learning is group similar things. Reinforcement learning, she defined as learn by doing. And then when it comes to the generative AI, she said make plausible fakes. So this makes me think about the risk of generative AI, especially the hallucination you mentioned or misuse. So at Vector's roundtable sessions, our discussions continue to return to the theme of responsible development and use of generative AI, to think through how we can harness the vast potential of these technologies while mitigating risks such as misuse, privacy, security, or misinformation. So also we need to think about the generative systems whose aim is to generate new things that never exist, right? So, and if you think about the hallucination part, what I've seen is that these systems are meant to create your dream, because you're giving a prompt, right? The prompt that your imagination, and then it gives you a thing that never exists. So my question to you, Cameron, is that how can businesses ensure that they are balancing the benefits and then the risk, for example, like a privacy, as I mentioned, data security, especially like you have a background on finance institutions and healthcare. So what's your insights?
So my first question is, do you think she used generative AI to get those definitions? Because they're all pretty good and they're all pretty concise. And that's an example of the cool things you can do, right? So there's no risk in her doing that. But she said, you know, you could just say, explain what supervised learning is in 3 words. And you could just keep going through that and end up with all your answers. So I think that's a good example of something that's low risk. If you get these wrong, there's, you know, again, somebody said that doesn't sound quite right, but you can take a look at that and say, all right, it can be, you know, you can ask the foundation model to try again and do a better job. Anyhow, so back to the question about financial institutions and healthcare. I think the short version of this is if you're a large enough company, you can afford a private cloud. That's the way you do it, right? So it's really about privacy. You know, you still need your individuals trained on what to do and not do online. So code review would be a good example, right? You're happy because they're doing code review, but you're not happy because they're putting it in some tool online to do that. And so, like, all right, so you're doing part of it right, but not all of it right. And I think any company of any size that thinks they don't have these challenges of people going and using these publicly available tools on proprietary things are wrong. That does exist. So private cloud is the easiest and best way to do it. Easy maybe isn't the right term, but it comes back to it's also expensive. But if you have a cloud infrastructure, then that's absolutely the way to go. So I think, and especially for healthcare. So the other challenge, and for those of you that don't know, Sedef and I work together. So the other interesting thing that we heard yesterday that I really liked was, actually, maybe you weren't in the room on this one. This might have been one of our roundtables. But on the security side, actually, no, it was Nicola, sorry, who said it's very hard to do de-identified data that's publicly available because you don't know how much information the person trying to re-identify it has. And so there are risks like that. So really the only way to deal with that is to have a private place where your data sits. And so that's one of the pieces. And different countries have different rules around this too, right? So if you think about a place like, I think it's Norway that has all their tax returns online, yet Canada somebody would go to jail for that. So again, it's also local context. But when you think about that ability to protect your data, that's kind of your starting point. So a lot of this is rooted in privacy. And as you said, Sedef, where you have the training of people comes back to here's how you protect data. So if you think about online fraud, or you think about companies getting attacked by hackers, most of these, it's still the human in the loop is the problem. They clicked on a link they shouldn't have, right? It's all these things. So it really is, how do you help your people learn and be protected?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on the human in the loop for a sec. So we know that it is very critical, and it was also stressed. This was also stressed in Vector's roundtable sessions, that the importance of the organizations ensuring that there is a human in the loop, someone responsible for within the generative AI outputs before they go to, say, for example, clients or customers. And then those people will need specialized training to detect and amend like errors in the output, especially when those outputs conform to human biases or like a machine hallucinations appear realistic or convincing that we talked about. So in your opinion, how the organizations effectively implement those human in the loop mechanism as a, let's say, security protocol in this kind of like a generative AI applications to make sure that responsible and secure deployment of those technologies?
Yeah, really good question. So to me, this sounds an awful lot like what you do in software development anyhow, right? These practices do go across. And so you need quality control and quality assurance, and those are still done best by humans. Now, generally, humans are fallible. So the example that I would draw is if you think about autopilot on an airplane. If the pilot is spending too much time flying a plane on a long flight, because pilot error is still the #1 cause of accidents, the pilot gets fatigued, and when there's emergency, they can't respond quickly enough. The other side of that is if the autopilot does too much and the human is and when an emergency happens, the pilot isn't connected, the pilot doesn't see it coming, and so they have less ability to react to it. So same sort of thing, there's a partnership between the system and the individual, and in doing that, that's really where that comes together, and they're in a position where you get more value out of it. So I know it's funny math, but you're really trying to find how does 1 + 1 = 3. And so it's an example of that. So it comes back to good practices of quality control, good practices of making sure it's thoughtful in design. So any good project, you're going to spend 10 or 15% upfront just scoping out your project. What are we trying to accomplish? What is our ground truth? Which means what happens today and how do we compare against that to make sure that the future is, or what the output we're getting is correct. So some of those practices are still, I don't think those go away, and they're incredibly important. And again, this still is about people. So if you think about, if we want people's lives to be better, then it really is having the human in the loop. So another good example of this, and I'll go back to healthcare, is the FDA is the US approval agency for medical devices and drugs and all sorts of things. It's for the healthcare space. So I looked at it and thought, well, because of the way you have to get software code through, which is explaining your code, how do you do this in the future with AI that you can't actually explain? And what they did is said, as long as this is as good or better than a doctor, this is the very first thing they approved, and it was around medical imaging, you can use this. So the neat thing about it was it took only 20% of the time to interpret the image compared to a human doing it. So it would only take 15 minutes instead of 75. And if you think about that, would you rather have your doctor spending time looking at a screen and trying to interpret what's going on? Or would you actually like them to spend more time with you as a patient to say, here's how we're going to treat you? So that's some of the ways that I think that intersection of humans and technology get better.
Okay. Thank you for your insight. So you mentioned about like a code review and, the FDA, like how they approve the medical devices in the US. And, I'm sure like there are similar approval mechanism in like a different jurisdiction in different countries. And then, similar to what companies are been working on. And, they have already, code of conduct or their guidelines, like how they approve some of the things before they go into their customer or like, their consumer and whatnot. So I think the matter of how they're going to modify already existing mechanisms to include some of those, the risky points that generative AI technologies will bring.
Definitely.
Thank you. So I wanted to touch on a little bit of like education piece. So I've seen a recent article, it was, I guess, yesterday or the day before, at Forbes, one of our ecosystem company, Private AI CEO, Patricia Tain, she talked about the impact of generative AI on education and child safety and roles of technology leaders in protecting against cyberbullying or safety of the children and teens. So the topic is very dear to my heart as a parent and also as an educator. So we have been talking about risk and mitigation on businesses and content creators, artists, but unfortunately not so much related to the children or like education. So I wanted to ask you your opinion. What do you think about the hallucination challenges, for example, like the impact of the education?
I think this is going to be hard, and I don't think there's any other way to look at it. So we already have enough problem with misinformation, and it used to travel by word of mouth. And when you think about historically, not going back hundreds of years ago, but 100 years ago, when you really had radio or print or the spoken word, like there wasn't much beyond that. And so those were centers that they were common mechanisms for people to get information. So you could listen to the radio to get the news. So there was a case where an American author read The War of the Worlds, and everyone thought we were being invaded in the US. The US thought they were being invaded by aliens. And so this wasn't true, but that was their trusted source. And now you have something that's fiction going through there. Now, I think the problem is much worse and it's much larger. So in North America, an excessive amount of people get their news and their information from social media, which is quite frankly terrifying, because there are lots of actors on there that have other purposes for doing that. And so when we think about our kids growing up and the access to misinformation, it's so much easier to get. And it's really hard for them to, they don't have judgment to understand what might be true and might not be true. And so I think it'll take more parental interaction. So spend more time with your kids. That seems like a good thing on a bunch of different levels. Understand what's important to them. And then the other analogy I would draw is we can all remember a time when email was really hard to use because there was so much spam. And the number is still something like 85% of all email is still spam. It's hundreds of billions of emails a day. But spam filters are very good at eliminating that. But it took a long time and an awful lot of training data to get very good at it. But I think in the future, or I would hope in the future, that we're going to see things that are like spam filters, but for information. And then it still comes back to what is the source of truth. And unfortunately, lots of data most of the data we work with is interpretive data. And so an example I will give you is this glass. So this glass is a water glass. It's a half-liter glass. You could describe it in a bunch of different ways, right? So whatever your perspective is, you would look at that and say, and you also don't know if it's plastic either, but you would interpret it by looking at it. So even though we're all looking at the same thing, we may have a different description of it. And there was a story called The Blind Men and the Elephant. So they're all around the elephant, and one's saying, well, it's rough and large, and another one says, well, it's kind of wormy like a snake, and all these different things. And so that's a data problem. And so I think those are still going to be issues in the future. But I would hope we're going to come up with something like spam filters that will help filter some of this out.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And then maybe my recommendation would be the technology companies who are developing these kind of technologies, like tools and techniques. So they also need to work with the institutions, like education institutions, and they need to work with them, like educate the teachers, or like university instructors and whatnot. So I think they need to also collaborate before they moving or releasing those kind of technologies. So this might be another way. So I really like your idea of putting a spam filter, like similar to the spam filter for the knowledge. So I think that might be also a good, but we'll see how that works.
Well, I also think you touched on a very good point. And what that is the tech companies need to be accountable, right? And part of the challenge really is, and I believe in capitalism, just to be clear, but part of the challenge is in reinforcement learning, you use something called a value function or a goal. So what is your objective? And unfortunately, in a lot of businesses, especially with social media, it's engagement. So if you liked something, it's going to continue to feed you more of that thing you like to keep you on there looking at it longer. And if it's misinformation, it'll take you down that pathway. And so I think there has to be some accountability with these large companies on the spread of misinformation. It doesn't matter if it's in error. It doesn't matter if it is accidental. It still happens. So they need to be part of the solution.
Exactly.
Accountable.
Yeah, exactly. So I know we have like a few minutes left. So my last point that I wanted to talk with you about the governance piece. So in our roundtables, most of the discussions focused on the critical importance of taking a holistic view of generative AI that includes not just machine learning models and systems, but also the law and regulations and norms needed to make safe and effective use of these technologies. So businesses tend to think of laws and regulations and external forces acting on and shaping their activity. And so some argue that we need to develop a new regulatory infrastructure that can accommodate the innovation and diversity of those kind of technologies while also protecting the public interest and safety. And some says that, we need to modify our existing ones because the technology is like very fast advancing. So then in order us to keep this pace, so we need to use our existing one and modify it. So in your opinion, do organizations need to set up a new governance framework specifically around generative AI?
I think most definitely. So there's the privacy piece, but then there's also how you utilize it internally. So we've seen companies that are on their third, fourth iteration of their generative AI governance policies because it's changing quickly. But one example that I really liked was if you're doing research, let's say for a new business idea, use it for the initial research, but then go back and fact check and go back and make sure you're using it for the right purpose. So I do think the governance piece is largely around how do you protect your data. And then the other part is how do you use it and what's an appropriate use? And I think it's up to the companies to decide what an appropriate use is. But it still comes back to you need to protect your reputation, you need to protect your customers and all those sorts of things. And I know we're at the end, but those of you online won't actually know that Siddha's been working on what would now be called generative AI for over close to 5 years, actually. And so I wanted quickly for her to comment on how she's seen it change over time. We were talking yesterday about 4.5 years ago, how we were impressed with the results we were seeing in a BERT model, which is no longer large, but at the time was large, and how you've seen that evolve over time.
Yeah,
I also didn't give her this question in advance either, so I'm putting her on the spot.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for putting me in a spot. So yeah, as you mentioned, so 5 years ago or 4.5 years ago, we conducted this research, not a research, like a collaborative project using transformers. So now the transformer is based on those generative AI models in some form and shape. So that time we were looking at like a similar task, like a summarization, question and answering, and looking at not only pre-training big models, but also how we can use those pre-trained models for our own purposes. For example, like fine-tuning in like a different domain. So for example, if you have a finance data, if you are in the finance institution, working in the finance institution, so you could use your own data and then you can fine-tune those kind of big models, so you don't need to invent the wheel. And then those results were pretty impressive at that time as well. So again, it's been 5 years since then. So the research has been advanced, but still, like, the foundation models are still very strong. So then we see like a similar result that we have seen now, is especially on like a fine-tuning in the different domains, or again, like a similar task, like a summarization and whatnot. But again, when the architectures are now a little bit different than it before, so then now they are more powerful in terms of generating new things. And then generative models, as you mentioned at the beginning, they're not new. So for example, GANs. Some of our researchers, they've been used this kind of, especially on the computer vision side. So they've been using and they've been advancing this kind of models since the beginning. So those are my like observations from that project.
Thank you. Now, do we have time for Q&A? Because I see a couple of questions in the chat.
Sure, if you have any Q&A sessions. So, hello, Fatih.
Thank you, guys. A very good presentation. We have last 2 questions for you, and one of them coming from Mr. Barış Kaplan. I will share on the screen, and I will write a review for you. Is there a way Vector Institute is using for balancing the training amount in order to not get hallucinated model results as much as possible? If so, can you please explain? From Mr. Barış Kaplan.
Yeah, so different models behave differently, so I don't think there's any clear-cut way of doing that. It's interesting. So they put GPT into Bing search, and if it doesn't like your answer, it'll actually cancel your session. So there's all sorts of strange things happening. So I think it's really an open problem at this point, but I'm also happy to if Sedef has some comments on this too. But I think at this point in time, it's less about the training data and more about the model and how it works.
And then just to add to your comments, Cameron, so at Vector, our AI engineering team, they've been working with like open models. So we are focusing on the model piece and then how those models can be utilized in like different purposes. So I think that's the way we are doing right now at Vector.
Okay, thank you. And last question is coming from the B7K. Can you give examples of AI tools you use for own data workflow and explain precisely how it reshaped the way you personally operate?
Do you want to go first, Sedef?
Sure. So I use ChatGPT for GPT-4 version, like a paid version. So I just, it, as I mentioned earlier, so it's an 8 for me. So, and then it's usually a starting point. So when I, get my thoughts together, so I just wanted to make sure that, if I miss anything or not. So those are, thoughts that ChatGPT is giving me are helpful, as I, of course, I usually check at the first time, few, I think it's 6 months or 8 months ago when I, were really interested in, and then using some of the, the prompts, and then I realized that the references, because I'm coming from the academic background, so I usually check all the papers reference that I read. So just want to check if they're, and then those references give me another references that I can go and look for different information. So when the ChatGPT is giving me, I asked it, what are the references? And then when it gives me the references, and I go and check the references, and I realize that those references are not exist. And then that I realized that it is hallucinating, that I haven't seen that or any of the news until that time. So again, checking those facts are important for me. So I'm, occasionally use ChatGPT and to, again, give me as a starting point, so then I can move forward.
Okay.
Yeah, so I use ChatGPT, I use Gmail, and Gmail will give you autocomplete for things. I mentioned Grammarly earlier, and that really is around, it'll do some rewriting, but punctuation and things like that. So those are the main ones that I would use. One of the other ones I use, which isn't necessarily generative AI, is called, it's escaping me here, Speechify. And I can actually listen to documents, or I can read them, it'll highlight what I'm reading at the same time. But again, we don't put confidential things in there because you don't know where your data is going.
Actually, one example just came to my mind, not the tool that I'm using, but before this ChatGPT came around, and a few years ago when we were doing this NLP project, one of our students, actually, he put together a tool that uses the transformer models. And then, because for the researchers, reading like a conference papers or most influential papers are really hard. They have to sit like hours and hours to read those papers. They do, but if they wanted to get, a quick summary, so then that student developed a program, and then that program reviews the conference papers and then get the summaries and then reads to you with the human voices. So it was really impressive at that time. It was like 3.5 years ago. And then, how the technology evolved afterwards. So my point is that, there were such ideas, and then the tools that researchers have been working on. in the matter of going to the OpenAI and then they're like huge computing resources and then release these kind of the models afterwards. So this is just a thing that I just remember.
Thank you, Sedef. Thanks for being here with us. I wish you have a great day, evening, night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thanks, Cameron. Bye.
Bye.
Evet sevgili izleyicilerimiz, Levent T-Gate'den gerçekleştirdiğimiz Türkiye Yapay Zeka Zirvesi'nin ikinci gününü, online gününün canlı yayınının sonuna geldik. Yaklaşık 8,5 saattir sizlerle birlikteyiz. Dilimizin döndüğü kadarıyla RPA'den chatbotlara kadar yapay zekanın tüm detaylarını konuşmaya ve sizlerle paylaşmaya çalıştık. Katılımlarınız için teşekkür ediyoruz. 2 gün sonra biliyorsunuz Türkiye Cumhuriyeti'nin 100. yılını kutlayacağız. Ulu Önderimiz Mustafa Kemal Atatürk ve silah arkadaşlarının bizlere hediye ettiği Cumhuriyetimizin 100. yılı kutlu olsun diyoruz. Ve seneye bu vakitlerde belki de 2. yüzyılın ilk Türkiye Yapay Zeka Zirvesi'nde de birlikte olmak üzere. Hoşça kalın diyoruz. Kendinize iyi bakın. Cumhuriyetle kalın.